Welcome to Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture, hosted by me, Alexandria Miller. Strictly Facts teaches the history, politics, and activism of the Caribbean and connects these themes to contemporary music and popular culture. Wagwan everyone, I'm Alexandria Miller, and I'm back with another episode of Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture. I am really excited for this episode because it's one I've wanted to do for a while now. And so without giving too much of a more formal introduction as I usually do, I'm just going to throw out some things and see if Uno pick it up. So, Shatas, the right and the wrong, Bacchanal time, the sweetest mango, pausing for dramatic effect, maybe a little bit. If you didn't catch it or, you're not familiar with some of those, we are talking about Caribbean films in this episode today. And joining me for this amazing discussion is Klieon John, founder of Twin Island Cinema and the upcoming awardee of the Tilting Axis Fellowship. So big ups there. Klieon, thank you so much for joining me for this episode. Why don't we start a little bit, you telling our Strictly Facts listeners a little bit about yourself, your connection to the region, which some of them might have guessed from Twin Island, maybe. There's a couple of Twin Islands, so maybe.
Yeah, there are.
Right. So, I'll let you tell our listeners, and of course, what inspired your passion for Caribbean film.
Okay, well, first of all, Alexandria, thank you so much for having me. I love talking about the Caribbean in any aspect at all. I think being a Caribbean person is my favorite thing about myself, right? So any opportunity to just run my mouth about the Caribbean is just heaven for me. And yo, you just let off a list of classics in that intro. I got super excited.
Minute after I had to start off and come proper, I came proper. I was like, I'm dropping the classics for some people, but there are several. We will get into it more, but
Yeah,
I don't want to interrupt your intro.
Yeah, well, so I don't know. I mean, I always kind of get a little bit flustered when people ask me to like introduce myself or say, anything about myself because I feel like my life and career are rather eclectic. I mean, I've been in the media since I was 14 years old, which I still find surprising, and I always try and fact check myself, but it's true. I mean, I started hosting a TV show when I was 14. And, my early years in the media, I spent mostly in TV, radio, and print journalism. I remember walking into a building one day when I was like 17 and I said, "Hey, what is this place?" And they said, "Oh yeah, this is the newspaper." And I said, "Oh, I'd like to write for the newspaper." And that day I had a job and I was just always kind of doing that. And then my career sort of shifted into marketing and branding. That was after I graduated from UWI, where I studied media in Jamaica. So that I guess first outside my island connection. That twin island that you mentioned, by the way, is St. Kitts and Nevis. And so, yeah, so I lived in Jamaica where I studied media and I worked in the media for a good while, marketing, branding, social media, advertising. I hopped around the Caribbean, Barbados, Trinidad, sort of doing different, agencies, working with different corporate NGOs, government, all media stuff. And I've also been a part of different startups in technology, content. I mean, I've founded apps and websites and different things. I used to own a talent agency. It's a whole bunch of different stuff. I mean, I still look young and beautiful, but I've had such a long career, right? Where I really sort of like start outlining it that way. But over the last 5 years or so, I've been heavily focused on the film industry, specifically as a writer, director, and a producer. And I've also been involved through Twin Island Cinema as I've been involved in film curation, where we showcase and promote Caribbean films both locally and nowadays internationally. So we're trying to sort of promote and attract international co-production, which is its own sort of separate current to kind of navigate, because there's all sorts of different questions that come up with that. But yeah, I guess that's me in a very big nutshell. A coconut shell.
Now, really unbeknownst to me, right? Because I think when I think of film, I think of the classics, the 70s, as some of the ones that I mentioned a little
Yeah,
ago are from that period,
yeah,
but film in the Caribbean or films that at least took place in the Caribbean, depending on how you want to frame that, stem really as far back as the 19th century. But some of those films at that time, based off what we also know about history and colonialism during that period of time, these films that were potentially set here, or, they were oftentimes with foreign producers and filmmakers coming in and really trying to paint the region as exotic.
yeah,
Something that's, hasn't necessarily ended per se, but I definitely did want to uphold and make note of that, some of the histories of Caribbean film or, cinema in the region are really stemming from a perspective of colonialism, of imperialism, right? And then moving on a little bit from there, we really start to see films in the 20th century as well still take shape in that sense prior to that
mhm.
70s moment. And so what are some of the ways really you've seen early Caribbean films sort of just affecting the region in terms of this perception of us being exoticized, and othered based off this sort of foreign gaze?
Yeah, yeah. That's a really astute and I think um complex observation, right? Because the Caribbean, I think, has always been a complex place because of its positioning and its history and relationships with everywhere else around it, right? So its relationship to the Americas, to Africa, to Europe, um, as far back as the indigenous peoples, right? So we've always had this kind of injection of otherness coming from different places. So when I think about the Caribbean, I always have that in mind that we've always been a sort of a place that was susceptible to penetration, where we've always been a kind of a perforated sort of region in a way. If you look at a map of the Caribbean, that's what you see, perforation, right? And some of that perforation has been good and bad, depending on how you look at it. It's funny because even when we define the Caribbean, often we think about just the islands, right, the archipelago, but we often forget that parts of Central and South America are all
Indeed.
also touched by the Caribbean Sea. Like I started looking at a couple of films lately from like the 60s, I believe it was, with Ima Sumac, who was a diva from around that time. And one of the big issues even then was the fact that she was this big Hollywood star, this singer, this musician, and they were making a film about her culture where she starred, but they portrayed her people as sort of simple and a little bit money grubbing and kind of not very uh not as interesting as the European main characters. And well, that's the problematic side of it, where American or European main stars visit the region and they are sort of the main antagonists and protagonists of the story. And the Caribbean is sort of just a supporting background with supporting characters um and even that support is kind of underfoot and not really equal. We're often servers, waiters, forest guides, that type of thing. And it's interesting that you mentioned that it's still happening in a way because these days, in the Caribbean, yo, we're gonna get political. I don't know if you really want me to like talk some of the things,
Yeah,
them, like
go
what really
talk the things. That is what
because
the podcast is for.
one one of my, I guess, more critical observations, even of contemporary Caribbean film, which you can say is a lot more authentic. We're telling more quote unquote authentic stories. The stories are more. originating from the region and that kind of thing, which is great. But there's a lot of um, industry pandering, and I mean American style industry pandering, where hey, if you want to get this feature shot in the Caribbean, get a big American film star to be the main character and thing, and that's how you're gonna get it funded. And that's it's like, yeah, but we have really good actors here too who can be really good lead characters, lead men and women. We have excellent, talent here as well. I don't want to have to do the usual thing where we in some way pander to the North. And that has always been the challenge, right? From the jump with Caribbean cinema is how we are positioned both economically and through a narrative sense in relationship to the North, America, the UK, Europe. But then, on the flip side, right, because of this early interest from the North, right, even though it was an exoticized interest, they brought their cameras and their film crews and everything like that. And we got some really interesting visuals captured of the region. We get a sort of a slice of life at, um, how we were, even unintentionally, you capture um, our landscape, the community designs of the time. Music has always been a thing that has benefited a great deal from the film industry and vice versa. So, like, a lot of those early films in like the 70s and 80s, you realize a lot of them were about music. The harder they come, dancehall queen was a
My
big
faves.
one.
My fave.
So they really sort of help preserve parts of our culture, right? Even though we can now, with a modern, sort of more contemporary, and I guess more woke lens, look back at some of those films and say, well, they were kind of promoting shatter culture and they were promoting the kind of ghettoization and kind of making women out to be, overly sexualized objects, and they were sort of promoting a lot of careless things and stuff. But at the same time, damn it, our culture was still, you know, time capsuled in a way. So we can just toss it all out. And then I also think about the fact that, like, no, okay, the story is in our hand, right? The scripts, we're producing more on our own. We have these great film festivals around the region. We have great associations that are being formed in different islands. Shout out to places like, I don't know, Filmco TNT or JAFT Pro, Jam Pro, JAFTA Propeller programs. We have all these different organizations that are supporting Caribbean film. We literally just formed a new alliance called the CAFT Pro just recently. We just launched, and this is out of a group of us who attended the European film market, or the EFM in Berlin this year. And we just sort of came around the table and realized, yo, we need to unite and we need to be able to, like, go after funding in a collective way and support each other as a unit, right? So there's all these different types of associations and things forming now. And in the support that's now being created for Caribbean film, um, we have stuff to talk about. Even if it's stuff to correct, which is correcting some of the miseducation of us as this remote place, redefining what it means to be exotic, all these different things that we're correcting. We have content, we have something to kind of push off of, and that's what we need as artists. Artists are always sort of responding to a stimulus of some kind, so yeah, we have a weird relationship with the North, but it's still a part of who we are in a kind of way. So, yeah.
That makes complete sense to me, especially when we consider the fact that, like, there were three James Bonds shot in Jamaica, right? So you
Yeah,
have
yeah,
Dr. No, you have Live and Let Die. Those are 1962 and 1973 respectively, and No Time to
yeah,
Die, which is in 2021. There's a whole big thing around James Bond and
yeah, yeah,
Ian
Fleming, yeah.
Fleming in Jamaica, James Bond Beach, etc. Even I was really surprised to learn that that tail end piece, if anybody's seen Shawshank Redemption, the very end piece when they're like off on the beach was shot in the US Virgin Islands. So as you're
Uh,
saying, right, there are all of these connections that continue to happen, especially as we've talked about several times on the podcast with movement and migrations of our people, there is that push and pull in a sense. But I definitely do want to hail, as you were talking, some of the movies like The Harder They Come, right? There
mm,
are definite ones that, as we're seeing in our sort of post-emancipation period, right? Primarily, I'm thinking the 70s here. There is this moment where that I think for me sort of is the pinnacle of films of our generation, right? As you were saying,
mm,
us branding films for ourselves, um, describing what it is to be like that connection to music and culture. So you have The Harder They Come, you have BIM. There are several, I
mm.
mean, the list can go on, right? How critical do you think that period was in establishing Caribbean filmmaking, particularly for some of the parts of the Anglophone region? There are parts of Cuba in particular, had a little bit of an earlier start to some of the other islands. But that 70s period, how do you think it sort of impacted the trajectory moving forward?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of it has to do with this sort of independence movements that started popping up around that time. Um, we kind of took hold of the baton around that time in more ways than one, right? Politically, economically, and also through story, right? Because we realize now, all right, cool, it's our time to tell our story, and that sort of begins with the most basic declarations, right? The national anthem, the flags, these are things that form the name of a country, the identity, and these are artistic expressions, right? And then following from that, we get film. But even before film, it's funny because I was doing some research recently for a project I was proposing, um, and still proposing. I really hope somebody gives me money for it. Where I want to shoot a series on the kind of pillars of independence in St. Kitts and Nevis, right? So I'm calling this the project Stalwarts, because Stalwarts is in our national anthem, right? As stalwarts, we stand. And it's like, who are these stalwarts of our independence? You have the first prime minister, the first premier, but then also the artists. So I started looking into, well, who was the guy who wrote the national anthem, and the person who designed the flag. But then also around those times, we started to establish our carnival, and started to define what our sort of national celebrations and symbols and things would look like. And because of that creative expression, um, which seems to have been, I guess, a reflex. Like, is it that when a culture is experiencing a pivotal moment, something like an independence, there is a reflex, which is this need for creativity, for us to express ourselves as we are, what we're feeling, what we're thinking, the things that are important to us. We see this in modern times, in meme culture. I was making the point to a colleague the other day that during challenging times, the society runs to artists. You ever noticed that? They run
Definitely.
to creatives to ask us to make things to help society makes sense of what's going on, and to help us talk about what's going on and what we're feeling and that kind of thing. We run to artists for that. So we run to writers, and we run to singers and musicians, and then filmmakers. The Calypsonians. That's when they had the most to say. And and then also when you think about these kind of milestone creative moments in the region, no, as we're in what, the 20th, 21st century, something so. Um, we use those milestones to define who we are, right? If you want us to talk about, well, what is Caribbean music and what is Caribbean politics and what is Caribbean art and things. We draw for movies, and we draw for calypso songs, and we draw for Bob Marley songs that capture the time and things. So when you say, well, what's the importance? The films that are made are these milestones and these kind of like snapshots of our evolution, you know? I don't know if that's too meta, but
I
um
don't think so. I don't think so at all. I think there's a way when, especially as we come to understand independence movements for the region, particularly, right? Especially thinking with some of these films from the 70s. The film industry prior to this moment really wasn't captured from our perspectives, right? Like if you sit on and think of Dancehall Queen, well, that's a little bit later, but BIM, or Rockers, The Harder They Come, right? The way that those films are even shot, the people who are included, when you see the sceneries, you see, you know what I mean?
yeah.
They are fully authentic and I think descriptive. Um, and political, right? They may not have necessarily been like, wow, Jamaica is so grand and palm beaches and palm trees and coconuts or whatever the rhetoric typically is. They may have cast challenges that we've had, the urban plight, etc., but they are still very true to what was going on and their markers of the time, as you said. So I agree that I don't think that it was a meta answer at all. I think it was one that, highlights the importance of how we're captured and who does the capturing, um, recorded, song, or otherwise. So and I mean, I've shouted out BIM quite a few times because I think it's one of my favorites, but that one went on to like win several awards in the 70s, both in the Caribbean and elsewhere. I think it was also shown at like the LA Film Festival, if I'm not mistaken. So there are ways that, when we have the ability to really do the work, right? Um, Again, maybe this is gets to sort of the earlier point about the engagement with the North, with the global North, but it highlights something completely different that they've never seen. And I think that is sort of a testament to why we can do some of these things and still go elsewhere and go win the awards and mash up the place and all of the
Mhm.
things that we do, right? It's not the stereotypical we're at the beach and picking coconuts or whatever. That's not that is not the lived experience. That's not the end all be all of who we are.
Yeah, even though I love me some beach and some
Oh
coconuts,
yeah,
they're
no,
bad.
no, not dissing the thing at
So
all. But we,
definitely that too.
but there's more to it, right?
Yeah,
Um, you had touched on a point talking, I think, about funding and technology and stuff that I definitely wanted to uphold, especially as we're understanding this evolution of cinema and even maybe broader your own definition of cinema, because I think for some people they might think of it in terms of like big feature films, right? So, the dance hall queens and things to that nature, but then there are also like documentaries and short films and stuff. And so, what is maybe your definition of Caribbean cinema and how do you think it's been impacted by funding and technology and even sort of evolving now into the 21st century?
well, look, something I wanted to say earlier is that even before the 70s, right? Um, those films that you referenced before any kind of accessibility, even though it was externalized accessible in a sense, um, allowed us to even start making films. We were always telling stories, right? Through calypso, through reggae,
For
um,
sure.
through our cultural expression was always there, and I think and film is really a microcosm of cultural expression, right? It's an amalgamation of all of the things. Like I was teasing a photographer friend of mine the other day because um if you ever encounter photographers, I don't know what their thing is, where you have great photographers who are afraid to do video, afraid to do film. So, I think it's so intimidating. I'm like, bro, you only just pressing record instead of the shutter button, like it's the same. You just make the photo move. It's you're doing the same thing. And I also even tell writers this, and it's everything is a frame, right? Every page is a frame, every stage is a frame, every um in film literally call it a frame. um all expression is done through a frame, and sometimes the things in the frame does be moving and sometimes they don't be moving. So even when you say cinema, I always think about cultural expression in general, because we live in a movie. Yeah, when was the last time you take a country bus to go from Kingston to Mobile? When was the last time you jump on one of those bus?
Couple months ago.
Yo, that's a movie.
Yeah. What do you mean?
Caribbean
Driver,
people.
driver, let me off.
Hello, Caribbean people is a whole movie. Every day we are just constantly on set, and a man only had to press record. And to me, you just have perfect cinema. So when we call it cinema, what do we mean? Do we mean that we just captured it on a device? Okay, fine. And now to answer your question, um, so because of that, I think that Caribbean cinema is as diverse as the Caribbean itself. And the Caribbean is just pure diversity when you think of it. Even from small, we learned that there are different ways to define the Caribbean in social studies class. They say, well, there's the political Caribbean, there's the geographical Caribbean, there's the cultural Caribbean, the this, the that, the this, the that. But then, some islands are larger, some are smaller. So you have different levels of metropoli and sort of cosmopolitanism happening in different parts of the Caribbean. Different languages, of course. So the Caribbean, yeah, there's all this intersectionality, right? Where we can find distinctions, but there's also so much of like a Venn diagram in these islands. Spanish speaking. So okay, musically, what is dancehall and what is soca? Define the two of them for me now. Ain't got no difference between dancehall and soca these days. Yeah, And then I've been saying to people soon, we say the French speaking Caribbean, the Spanish speaking Caribbean, the speaking. There are so many of the language groups moving into the other islands and establishing sub communities that are then growing into other communities. So in the next few generations, we're going to see all of this type of these influences from other parts of the region feeding into each other as well. And because of that, our storytelling is the same way, right? Sukunya, Laja Bless, All Haig, they're kind of similar things in a way.
Definitely.
Jumbi, Junk, Canoe, what is masquerade versus who started it first. Well, in our island, we do this way, but it's the same version of that, but a different thing. And so that's maybe the intersectionality and the kind of, mix up and blend up that we are as a region. And I find that the cinema that I most appreciate coming out to the Caribbean is the same kind of mix up and blend up something. I like when a documentary can also fictionalize. And I like when something is between a feature and a short. So it's kind of like 30 something ish minutes going to, it's not really a feature, but it's not too short, you know? Because sometimes we talk long and sometimes we talk short. Sometimes the story is a long story, sometimes the story is a short one. Sometimes it's part fiction and part true. You know, in Jamaica they say if it not gossa, it near gossa. To me, that is, you know, that in itself is a genre, right? Near gusto. That's my new genre. I'm not a documentary, and I shoot near gusto. You know, I like when we lean into that aspect of it. I find I don't so much like when we are trying to recreate um an American 3 act structure. The minute somebody tell me about Save the Cat, I'm like, the cat, your blood, yo, I can't bother. You know, it's like I find, I get it. Okay, writing within a certain structure, the 3 acts, and then the rising action, and then this and the that and the thing, and this, the character must be in peril on page 9, and he must find himself, whatever, on this page and thing. I get the science behind of it, but it almost coming like cooking. Caribbean people, we don't use measurements and them something there when we cook. We just, it's like your hand
We
good or your
know.
hand ain't good,
We know. And we stop.
right?
When it we say, yeah man, the ancestors tell me say, yeah man, I ain't enough jerk seasoning yet.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that kind of vibe. So when I see us trying to recipe our cinema, I'm like, yo, I can't bother with it. This ain't Hollywood. This is a different place. So that's my thought. You also were asking me about technology. Our technology I think is obvious because you know you have more platforms actually. I find that's impressive. There are some platforms um that are originating from the region and that are dedicated to Caribbean film, and then also you know um, outside of the streaming platforms, and oh yeah, they're blanking on me. I know Studio Nancy's one. Uh, what was the other one I was talking about? I know Film Code does a kind of they have their own platform. There's another one whose name I'm blanking on. I'm sorry, but even outside of that, you know, through film festivals around the region, we're able to do screenings. There's more online events happening, and obviously people's access to mobile technology as well. Like, you know, everybody's a filmmaker. You know, obviously people, what is a photographer? What is a what somebody who has an iPhone? That's a photographer. Yeah. Um, so that's definitely a kind of an equalizing. It's like a democratic thing that technology is doing, right? But with the funding thing, it's a touchy one for me because I've been trying to fund projects for the last few years. I've had some success. Um, I would like to see more private sector funding happening for the film industry in the Caribbean, and it sort of speaks to a wider thing because when we talk about industry, right? What is an industry? And this is part of why I started Twin Island Cinema as well, because in the early days of me trying to produce more than just an ad, right? I realized, okay, a film is a fairly challenging thing to make, but there are other ways I can participate in the film industry than just making a film. There's film festivals, there's showcasing, and I realized that in my country and actually in many of the smaller islands, we don't have as much of a grasp of what there is to consume film wise from around the region. We don't realize that there are really good features being made, really good sci fi animations, kids stuff. Um, being made around the region. When you go to some of these festivals, Trinidad Film Festival, shout out to Timeri Film Festival in Guyana right now, started by a very, very, very dear colleague of mine, Romola Lucas. Um, who I owe a lot of my career in filmmaking to. Um, Excellent work that she's been doing over the last few years. So I started Twin Island to showcase films here, to promote films, to big up, actors and directors and writers around the region. So that was my contribution to the industry. When we talk about industry, we're talking about more than just content. We're talking about economy. We're talking about legal structures. We're talking about international relations, right? There's all these things that go into an industry. If all you have is films, but you don't have nowhere to show them and you can't make no money, you don't have an industry. You have a lot of films. And what's going to happen is that because a film is so blasted challenging to make, if you are a creative and artistic person, cares a lot about quality and you sort of want to make a name for yourself and think it's a bloody hard thing to do, right? Especially if you are in a small island or if you're in a place in the Caribbean that's somewhat remote or whatever. So you want to get some juice out of your squeeze, right? You want to set yourself up in a way that you can sustain yourself over time. You want to have some incentive. You want to make money, damn it. Um, Anybody who sort of says, "Oh, just do it for the love, do it for the love." Listen, I can eat for the love. I could do a lot of other things for the love, but I need money. Yeah, this is my career. This is what I do for a living. This is how I pay the bills. So it's got to pay the bills. So we need to do more work, I think, in the region as far as not just telling our story, which is great. I think we'll naturally tell our story. Caribbean people love chat, right? Um, but we need to focus on making an industry, an economy out of film, right? And how do we do that? I think you need the private sector to come along. A lot of us, we try to go to governments, and some governments do around the region have been supporting to an extent. But I think you need the private sector more as well, because the private sector is going to ensure that us as artists stay competitive, that we create with a mind for return on investment, that we establish ourselves professionally, that we have proper legal structures around our thing, that we're licensing things properly, that we're signing proper waivers, that we have contracts between ourselves and that kind of thing. So the question that you asked was about funding, but it's a bigger issue, which is just a lack. It's a somewhat impotent industry, and that's why we don't have no funding.
I'm gonna switch gears because I have a slightly mix-up question facts.
Oh Lord, you want more mix up?
Just a little bit, just from your expert opinion. One thing that's always interested me in how sometimes we are portrayed in film, or whether that is, by the North, or even just some of the politics around our own films. There are obviously things like the politics of language. I always hate to see a film that is, from foreign producers casting quote unquote us. And by quote unquote us, I mean some random person that is not Caribbean and then they've
Mm,
been asked to put
mm,
on a Caribbean
mm,
accent. Or, there's also this dynamic of us showing up as bad people. And really and truly, sometimes I'm like, yeah, man, we are bad people still, right? Nanya, the Maroons and all of these things, sure. But how do you think some of those things, sort of pit us into particular bubbles when it comes to filmmaking?
You know what bubble I am more afraid of? And it's related to that. I think it stems from a feeling that in the region, right? In order for us to be relevant and accepted as artists and creators, right? In order to justify why are you making something as frivolous as a film, um, we kind of have to make it about something social. There has to be a kind of a political statement. We have to kind of weave in something about um the struggle, it's like we kind of play into, I think we unconsciously play into that prescribed narrative, right? Because it's out of a need to justify, and which we do a lot of as Caribbean people. We spend a lot of the time justifying. Listen, American filmmakers, a man only have to say, okay, so it's a film about a shark and a tornado, and it's a lot of sharks and it's a lot of it's sharknado. That's what, and it's good, and I need $50 million, and I need to, and they're on the ground and they're gone, and it's like there's no stopping them. There's no stopping Americans when it comes to what they want to do, right? um like I just think about the money that's been spent on terrible movies. But for us, um in order for us to get the resources and stuff that we need and thing all the time, we often have to kind of, okay, Irie, yeah man, we had to kind of do that sort of song and dance. And what I want us to do more of is not just break out of these stereotypes in terms of content, but also break out of the stereotypes in terms of form too. So make a film because it's fun and because it's interesting to you and because it's pretty, and because whatever, because it's, as artists, that's kind of our freedom, right? Is to do a thing because it pleases us, and the rest of the world becomes inspired by it and they make it into a thing and whatever. But we still have a little bit more breaking out to do, you know.
I think on that point, what is one of my favorite questions of all to ask? We've talked about several films, so feel free. You can sort of repeat one or two if you want, but I think we've given some recommendations. What are some of your favorite Caribbean films? And that could be, a big feature film, a documentary, anything at all.
Oh gosh, yeah, boy. This question is like it's it's like, because there's so many. It's like, gosh, it's almost like asking me what's my favorite constellation or something like that. But okay, so yeah, we did talk about some of the classics, right? The Dancehall Queen, the Shatters, the World Cup, those kind of original, them OGs, Smile, Orange, those type of things. Um, but there's also a lot of cool stuff happening in the short space as well. Oh, right now, Cheese is out from, I believe, I think his name is Damian Marcano. I believe it's Marcano. I hope I'm not saying the first name wrong. Cheese. Yeah, Damian Marcano from Trinidad, I believe. Cheese was a shot that we showed a couple of years ago, and now the feature is out. I haven't seen the feature yet, but yo, this shot is so good and so creative. I don't want to spoil the
We won't give it away for the
plot.
people.
So Cheese is good. She Paradise, the feature is also out recently. I think it was like last year it came out, maybe early this year. That's Maya Cozier from Trinidad. The shot was out a few years ago, and that the shot was really really good. So now they've made the feature. Timeri Film Festival is, you can screen some of the films that are on Timeri, right, on their site. Um, so I would suggest that. Okay, so why I thought about Timiri was because there's a really cool shot by Ray Wiltshire, who is a new filmmaker, and it's called. And I saw the rough cut for it too, so that's why I'm kind of biased. But I know in the new thing it was called Eating Papa on the Seashore. Okay, yes, yeah, Eating Papa on the Seashore. That's the name of it. Really, really, really interesting film. Um, there's a documentary as well right now, and Timeri is screening it. It's called the Kalinago, yeah, the Kalinago Dream, right? That one is very, very cool. It's by Teddy Dwight Frederick, but it's about um the sort of I guess cultural and historical evolution of the Kalinago people. And also it's like featuring he's the first indigenous parliamentarian. I think he's a minister of government, right? So it sort of centers on his story. So I think it's very cool and it sort of represents that kind of cultural turning point too, because I actually think that uh man, there's so lately I've been so interested in our indigenous cultures, the Kalinago, the Taino, um, the Arawak, the Caribs, um, the Maroons as well. I've been following uh, the Maroon movement in Jamaica very, very closely. Shout out to Chief Corey. I think he's doing a fantastic job in terms of raising the profile of the Maroon culture there. Um, and there's also some movies coming out that are, I guess, reflecting that zeitgeist as well. So there's a movie about it's about Nanny of the Maroons, and I forget the name of it now. Um, so lately I've been very interested in the stories that come from our indigenous cultures and looking into how do we reconnect or open up our awareness to to that, because in the Caribbean we connect to everything. We think we're British, we think we're Spanish, we think we're French,
Dutch.
we think we're American, we think we're Dutch, we think we're all kind of things, but we don't realize that there were people here before as
Mhm.
well who are also part of us in our spirit and in our culture. Um, and that even though ethnically a lot of us are not necessarily of that lineage, or although we might well be, um, actually that's exactly what it is. It's us not even realizing how physically connected we may be to the indigenous peoples, because this idea of maroons, a lot of the maroons, um what we now know of as maroons, are actually indigenous people who were living in the hills, who sort of took in runaways, and you sort of had
Right.
that kind of blending and things. So a lot of us might have Kalinago and Taino running through our blood, and we don't even realize. So so yeah, I've been very, and actually Twin Island Cinema, our logo is it's a Kalinago symbol. It's the two eyes with the sort of face. A historian told me that uh it might have been like an owl or a type of bird that they would draw. It's found on a lot of their petroglyphs, and I thought it was really inspiring. So I sort of adapted it to the logo. You know.
As you've brought up Twin Island Cinema, I mentioned a little bit briefly that you are one of the awardees for the Tilting Access Fellowship. So again, props to you. And I think you'll be doing some work on Indigenous films or the history of Indigenous people in the Caribbean through that fellowship. What is your advice for, the next generation of people coming up and really hoping to break into the film industry?
Uh, I would love some advice myself. I always feel like I'm old before my time giving advice. You know, I'm at that age. What I would say is, I guess, a bit of what I said earlier, which is make stuff that you like, right? Everything that is important to you, that speaks to you, is relevant and is part of the zeitgeist. So don't feel like you have to make a film about this thing or that thing, or that it has to have a political statement, or it has to be socially important, or whatever it is. It could also just be fun and cool and exciting and interesting and just a vibes. It could really be anything. And also, I would encourage people to try and see the culture through the lens that I look at the culture, which is the whole of the Caribbean is a movie. Everything is a movie. Everything is a scene out here. So if you're struggling to think of what to make, just point your phone or something, and you get the inspiration. Go walk downtown Kingston, and the things that you'll hear people say, that will spark a storyline or whatever it is, a question. So just, I would say, make everything and anything. Make the horror, make the romance, make the drama, make the sci-fi, make the action, make the documentaries, make the biopics, make the everything. Just bring it all, bring it all, bring it all to the table. All of it is nice.
And vibes. It's all a vibe.
Yeah, yeah.
Klieon, thank you so much for joining me for this discussion. I feel like I'll have to have several more episodes on Caribbean films because as we were naming them, I was like, wait, but I didn't say. So,
I
I
know,
might
right?
have
There's so
to,
much more.
right, I might have to go into a special series on particular films or something in the future. But thank you again for,
Yes,
sharing your expertise and your experiences in the industry and, really just helping to ground us in, I think, something that is on minds in a sense sometimes when we're like, "Oh, yo, Sprinter upon Netflix, that bad,"
mm,
right? And then it's like, "Okay, but something even for me, it can be difficult." Now I think it's changed a little bit as we're talking over time, but, to access certain films, right, that accessibility issue can even be a thing historically. So, again, thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Strictly Facts. I really enjoyed it.
likewise.
To my listeners, I hope you did as well. Until next time, look more.
Look more. Big up yourself.
Thanks for tuning in to Strictly Facts. Visit strictlyfactspodcast.com for more information from each episode. Follow us at Strictly Facts Pod on Instagram and Facebook and at Strictly Facts PD on Twitter.